Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to request today's honorable speaker, Professor Jon Wilson, to deliver his lecture on Bangladesh and the global history of the nation state. Dear audience, let us enjoy the lecture now. Thank you very much.
Everyone, and thank you to the Asiatic Society for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is very much a return. Spent lots of time here over many years ago, and have spent lots of time in Bangladesh, mostly many years ago, as you mentioned in the citation, the beginning of my research, my PhD, and a lot of my second book were kind of based upon archival sources in the National Archives of Bangladesh, which is still one of the best archives anywhere. And so it's it's wonderful after far too long, 7 years since I've been in Dhaka, to be back. So this for me also, this paper is also a return really to intellectually a return to Bangladesh and a return to kind of South Asia, because my first two books are. First one's about East Bengal, the second is about the whole of the Indian subcontinent, and the book I'm writing now and have been writing now for far too long, for 3 or 4 years, is global in scope. And so to some degree I leave South Asia behind, thinking about the history of the nation state in the 20th century on a global scale, which is, I realise now, an extremely stupid thing to do, that trying to write something on that global scale is near impossible. So. But this is my attempt to reconnect back to to Bangladesh and to think about some of the arguments of the book with respect to this part of the world. So let me start. So Bangladesh joined the United Nations in 1974 as its 136th member. It did so in the same year as two societies with populations of less than 1 million, Grenada and Guinea-Bissau. The latter recently having been a colony of the last European state to lose its empire, Portugal. Bangladesh's emergence came at the scrag end of the process of decolonisation, marking it as an apparent latecomer to patterns and norms of global national sovereignty, which had seemingly been set a long time before. As the scholar Nazm al-Sultan notes, Bangladesh's own liberation was framed by its leaders through languages of colonial domination that many thought had been long superseded. We no longer want to live in a colony, Upanivesh, as Sheikh Mujibur Rahman put it in February 1971. But the complexity is that the colony of Pakistan itself claimed to be a nation state, which had itself achieved liberation from the imperial rule of the British, with support from many of those campaigning in 1971, fighting for Bangladesh. So how do we make sense of Bangladesh's apparently double and late liberation? Scholars have adopted a number of different strategies. The most common in Bangladesh, maybe, is to emphasize East Bengal's particular oppression and backwardness as a consequence, occurring under the domination of double domination, either Bengal's Hindu elites or West Pakistani ruling class, as well as British power. In these narratives of repetition, the past of oppression was so heavy it required Bangladesh to achieve its liberation multiple times, in 1947, 1971, perhaps even in 1905 as well. Challenging such stories by placing the history of Bangladesh into a single linear and global narrative in another recent article, the historian Faisal Devji suggests that we need to see 1971 not as a liberation into, but from, the condition of being a post-colonial nation-state. Bangladesh's independence, for Devji, saw the nationally limited political visions of the post-imperial world being jettisoned in favour of a rhetoric of apolitical humanitarianism. In 1971, according to Devji, Bangladesh left the logic of decolonisation behind, marking out a future in which freedom would be defined not in the name of national citizenship, but through Bangladeshis and everyone else being global subjects of universal human rights. These different explanations share a single point of reference, a single assumption: the apparent fact that a post-colonial nation-state, the nation-state of Pakistan, was created on the 14th of August 1947. That moment in these different accounts was either repeated according to the dominant Bangladeshi view, so the creation of two nation states, or was transcended, according to Devji in 1971. Instead, this article contests, this lecture contests. Amidst the fine-grained historical discussions of the events and processes which led to the partition of British India, historians have ignored, I think, one big question, and not asked what kind of state Pakistan actually was in August 1947. Pakistan was not a unitary nation state at that moment. It was had not even emphatically broken from empire. Instead, the political form which Pakistan was to take at that moment in August 1947 remained open, with different paths possible. One of those, possible maybe in 1947, was a loose federation with weak borders, in which East Bengal might have possessed significant autonomy and remained closely connected to social and economic life over the Indian border. Institutionally, Pakistan only, I'm going to suggest, became a nation state after partition. And it did so as part of the broader global process in which the nation state became the universal form of political life everywhere in the world in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So throughout the 50s and 60s, the movements which eventually led to Bangladesh's independence sought autonomy by activating those other possibilities which many thought were present in 1947. Most importantly, the development of Pakistan as a trans-regional, in some senses transnational regime. Those possibilities were, as I don't need to tell you, were closed off from the early 1950s onwards, resulting in the campaigns which led not to autonomy within a federal polity, but instead independence as a nation state. Bangladesh's emergence was indeed a rebellion against a post-colonial nation state, as Devji argues. But there was no repetition here, no kind of looping back to history, as historians often argue, because the nation state of Pakistan was not created with the support of Bengal's Muslims in August 1947, because it had not, in fact, been created in 1947 at all. I want to emphasize the global context to all this, and that's my key point today. As both Faisal Devji and Srinath Bhagavan argued, Bangladesh's independence was a global moment. It was accompanied by worldwide debate and campaign. It did, I think, as Devji suggests, mark the beginning of new forms of global politics, which have imagined the planet Earth's population as subjects of global humanitarian concern rather than citizens of nation states. But I think we can't forget the importance of the nation state. I mean, we don't need to remind ourselves thinking of the Podda Bridge and the kind of sort of nationalism, around that. A moment that is about a bridge that evokes a national economy, a national people, etc. The nation state matters, has mattered, continues to matter in Bangladesh. So of course the Bangladesh movement did lead to a nation state as well as this other kind of global politics. And I think my point is that since 1971, Bangladesh has faced in both directions. It's a society which proudly but not uncontroversially celebrates its existence as a unitary national political community, but it's also been a repository for international humanitarian concern and action. And I guess it's those dual roles that I want in this lecture to explain. So let me begin with two apparently very different contradictory moments in the 1940s. The bulk of what I have to say today has to do with the 1940s and early 1950s. First, in December 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, Muhammad Ali Jinnah introduced two books which collected the Punjabi journalist Muhammad Sharif Tuzi's arguments in favour of Pakistan. Jinnah and Tuzi made the case for separation. Jinnah began his forward in partial agreement with a common British argument about the internal divisions of India. India of modern conception, he said, with its so-called present geographical unity, is entirely the creation of the British, Jinnah argued. It had become one administrative unit by a system of bureaucratic government whose ultimate sanction is the sword and not the will or sanction of the people. Unlike imperial historians, though, Jinnah argued that nations did exist in India. It's just that there were multiple in the subcontinent. India was, he said, composed of nationalities and races. India was not a national state, he didn't use the word nation state, he said national state, but a, quote, subcontinent composed of nationalities which each had different, in many ways, as he put it, antagonistic culture, civilization, sense of value and proportion, and social and moral codes. What Jinnah called constitutional government was impossible, he argued, if India was to remain united. And Jinnah argued that partition was necessary for democracy to exist in South Asia. Fortunately, Jinnah suggested, Muslims were in a solid majority in areas he called the Muslim homelands to the northwest and the east. These could easily be separated from the rest of India and constituted into independent sovereign states. At face value, Jinnah seems to be, in 1942, to be making the case for the emergence of Pakistan as the kind of thing that I'm arguing precisely was not a culturally homogenous unitary nation state. 5 years later, though, we get a different perspective from a different lens. A few weeks after the British Empire had collapsed 5 years later, after the British Empire and its allies had defeated the Axis powers, but was itself teetering on the edge of collapse, in the end of the month of August 1947, a group of predominantly Muslim merchants wrote to Khaja Nazimuddin, chief minister of what they described as Eastern Pakistan, suggesting something very different. Those merchants were asking for permission to issue capital to support the development of cotton fields and textile mills, which they argued would, quote, render valuable services to the poorer and labourer classes of the Muslims of Bengal by providing employment. But their relationship with the territory demarcated as Pakistan by the Radcliffe Award was very limited. Every member, and this letter is to 28th of August 1947. Every member of the firm's board of directors was based in Calcutta. In 1945, they bought plots of land to cultivate cotton in predominantly Muslim areas of Nadia that nonetheless remained on the Indian side of the border. The businessmen don't mention anything happening in the territory of East Bengal in their first letter. But they seem to imagine that Pakistan was not a territory. So my point is, they seem to imagine that Pakistan was not a territorially defined nation state. Instead, they saw it as a looser political force that would oversee the interests of Muslims throughout Bengal, and would continue to have social and economic connections across the Radcliffe Line borders. So, as I just said a moment ago, their first letter to the Pakistan government was written on, I think I've got the date wrong, I think it was the 25th of August 1947, after the border had been demarcated and the land, business, and apparently future enterprise of their Bay of Bengal cotton company had been delineated to be part of the territory of a different state. Or maybe these people just didn't know what was going on, they're really out of touch. Well, it's hard to argue that, because when you look at who the directors were, these were really powerful, clued up, plugged in people within Bengal. The directors included Abdul Hamid Chowdhury, for example, then associate of Surawadi and deputy president of the Bengal Legislative Council, then resident in Calcutta, soon to be later on Speaker of the East Bengal Provincial Assembly. In 1972, of course, Chowdhury's son became the first president of Bangladesh. So this group knew as well as any others what Pakistan meant at the time. And it's striking that they didn't imagine the new state to be exclusively concerned with the population and economic activity demarcated by Pakistan's national boundaries. So how do we make sense of these two contradictory moments? First, Jinnah's apparent invocation of a future Pakistani nation state, this kind of unitary culture, supposedly, a state that's defined in terms of a unitary culture, etc. And second, a group of, and very sharply demarcated from India, and second, a group of Muslim leaders assuming that Pakistan was anything but a nation state, but a kind of vaguer political force looking after the interests of Muslims across the region. So we need, I suggest, to place the creation of Pakistan in a global context and to look at the assumptions that are made on a global scale in 1947 and around that time, and look beyond the South Asian borders, which usually confine discussion of partition and post-imperial state formation. The nation state has been such a powerful force in the life of the world since the middle of the 20th century that I think we lose sight of the possibility and the real existence of other forms of political organisation relatively recently, in the 1940s, for example. So my point is that it wasn't just that Pakistan wasn't a nation state in 1947. There weren't any, or there were very few nation states anywhere in 1947. And so the nation state didn't really exist, at least in the way we understand it today, either in 1942 or 1947. Now, to an audience of historians, etc., social scientists, that argument perhaps seems far-fetched. So before getting back to talk about historical events and processes, I should explain exactly what I mean. The nation state is a form of government which effectively claims, more or less effectively, claims that political power is exercised on behalf of a single national community, It's a polity in which state institutions, territory, people, and economy coincide with one another. Nation-states act on behalf of what's seen as a self-determining national people. Almost all nation-states claim to be democracies, even if many are actually not. Within a national territory, by managing a national economy. If one imagines government, territory, people, and economy as separate layers, in a nation-state the boundaries of each are supposed to cut through in exactly the same place. The concept that binds these different phenomena together is sovereignty, the idea of ultimate absolute power, which in the nation-state is seen as being vested in the national community, in the people, the national people, and then exercised over different domains of life. That, at least, of course, is the norm, a set of assumptions significant enough group of people within nations' world share to make effective. So 2 ideas are vital, I think, for us to make sense of the nation-state in its history. First, we need to see it's not merely an idea, but something which exists in practical, institutional life. The latter provides provides a vital orientation for the everyday goings-on in politics, government, culture, education, and so on in practice. This is not just about political theory; it's woven through, kind of political and institutional practice. So politicians speak in the name of it. Sheikh Hasina opens the point of bridge in the name of it. Through statistics, administrators define it. Educational institutions teach its history. Schools in Britain now have to teach the history of the extremely turgid history of Britain, sadly, but rather not enough global history, and so on. Such institutional practices reflect a sense of internal national sovereignty, or the sense that a national people have control over national affairs. And I don't, given so many events in the world, whether it's Brexit, whether it's the Point of Bridge, whether it's Donald Trump, etc., I don't need to, I don't need to kind of remind you how important, the nation state is to us now. But so it's important here to just draw a distinction between the idea of a nation and the reality of being a nation state, and particularly historically. Scholars, because I think scholars, in particular European scholars, often focus on the origins of nationalism and national identity, and then assume that ideas about the nation produce the end point of national sovereign power. In doing so, Indian nationalism becomes the same as the nation state. History ends in 1947 or whatever. In doing so, I think they confuse possibility with actuality and fail to notice the other ways things might have worked in practice from different points of time in the past. I think Eurocentrism is often built into that approach. National possibilities in Europe are often placed on a single inevitable line which leads to the 20th century, although historians disagree about when nationalism in the nation state begins. Is it the early modern period, medieval period? Maybe is it the French Revolution? Whenever but they kind of plot this sort of like single inevitable line leading from nationalism, national identity in the sort of earlier periods to the nation state, to a world of nation states. Whereas they argue then that the nation state in Asia or Africa is seen as derivative of ideas or events from a distance, and that I'm familiar with the work of people like Partha Chatterjee and so forth will understand that how that kind of debate about the derivative nature of nationalism is very live, and I'm just saying we can just jettison the whole thing. The point is that we need to break the claim that connects the existence of national communities or nationalist ideologies with the world society of nation states which emerged in the middle of the 20th century. That means, in particular, recognizing that the nation state emerged everywhere at the same time in the middle of the 20th century, with the collapse of Europe's empires being particularly important. So it wasn't invented in Europe, it was something that was kind of produced across the world at a single, or more or less a single moment. So secondly, and connected to that, each nation state only exists as part of a world society of other nation states. You can't have a single nation state on its own. That's because sovereignty only exists if it is recognized by other states. It requires other regimes to recognize national borders. A border is two states joining each other. National currencies, which have to be exchanged, a nation's citizens, and so on, and to recognize the nation state's participation within international institutions. Of course, recognition does not need to be absolute. States such as Israel and Taiwan exist, which haven't been formally recognized by all other states, and yet still function. But as, for example, Bangladesh's intense lobby to be recognized globally and then to join the United Nations in 72-73 demonstrates, recognition by a significant proportion of global society is essential for a nation state to exist. So, Before the early 20th century, the world was divided more or less into imperial states, not nation states. In most cases, what often gets described as European nationalism is inseparable from the idea that European states should possess territories overseas, whether on the European continent or not. So people talk about German unification in the 1870s or whatever. Well, one of the key demands of German unification is Germany needs to be powerful and then have an empire and be able to rival Britain. And of course, Germany is not united as a nation, but as its status is an empire with an emperor. The idea of sovereignty, of absolute legitimate state power, was crucial here, but it usually referred to the authority of imperial rule over multiple territories, not a nation state. So in the 19th century, those states included the European regimes of Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, etc. Maybe Denmark sometimes as well. But also outside of Europe, the United States and Japan. Those imperial states shared a common way of dividing the world according to a hierarchical scheme of civilization, in which it was legitimate, they argued, for advanced people to rule supposed inferiors. The last decades of the 19th and first decades of the 20th century saw growing campaigns for national self-determination throughout the world, which challenged the administration of the world by empire. Usually describing themselves as nationalists, the people leading those campaigns did not though, straightforwardly argue for the creation of nation states, but contemplated a complex variety of different structures which allowed individual communities to determine their own affairs. Nationalist campaigns accelerated in particular at the end of the First World War, where the great powers formally affirmed the principle of self-determination, at least for people of European descent. But the states which emerged from empire, the empires that collapsed in the late 1910s, so the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, were not nation states. The years after the end of war saw the eruption of numerous independent polities that sought to give nations self-determination as part of more complicated amalgams of people. Some were short-lived: the West Ukrainian People's Republic, the state of Slovenes, Croats and Serbs, the Republic of German Austria, the Federation of Central America. Nobody's heard of any of these states, but that was how people throughout the world thought that kind of national self-determination was going to work. Others of these states survived, at least for the bulk of the 20th century. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, for example, neither of which was certain whether they were federations of multiple societies or unitary states. And both of them have divided, of course, since. And most importantly was the most frequently cited model for bringing multiple nations together into a single post-imperial state, a model that was cited widely across India in the 1920s and 1930s, the Soviet Union. So the decades after the end of the First World War saw an increasing proportion of the Indian subcontinent's population campaign, of course, for greater self-government. Self-determination and nationalism were crucial slogans. But my point is there was no consensus about how self-determination was to be achieved, how to define the nation, or even how many nations existed within the subcontinent. Supporters of self-rule were confronted with the question of how to square India's scale and multiplicity with effective political coordination, how to manage region-wide systems, whether railways, rice cultivation, or religious pilgrimage, without violently undermining the very different ways of life that constituted India's society. South Asia's plurality was the starting point for almost all people, almost all political leaders, kind of talking about what South Asia's political future was going to look like and what kind of nation, if you like, was going to exist, what kind of state was going to exist. So the unitary sovereignty asserted by the British Raj was seen as ineffective, out of touch, and dangerously prone to violence. For most, federalism seemed to offer a form of government able to recognise multiple centres of power, but also provide effective communication. So, advocates of self-determination, and I'm talking about South Asia between the wars here, proposed federations which connected different entities at different levels. And Gandhi, didn't use the word federal very much, but his politics were premised on the creation of a federation of villages with very few political structures at a larger level. Some figures, such as the Punjab Congress leader Lala Lajpat Rai, went so far as to argue that India's diversity needed to be recognised through its separation of multiple sovereign states, which would then combine after they learned to live together after independence. Congress leaders argued that self-governing India needed to be reconstituted as a federation of regions based on cultural and linguistic identity, rather than the arbitrary vicissitudes of imperial politics. There's an important argument about, when the kind of Indian flag with the kind of wheel was on it, was being proposed. One of the arguments about the wheel was that each of the spokes was supposed to symbolise the different regions of India. And in 1935, the British responded to the kind of campaigns for more self-determination and also for this kind of federal, kind of moment by creating a constitution, of course, which defined India as a federation. The government of India Act Constitution formally, kind of sees India's subcontinent as a federation, although it's still a very strong imperial centre. As late as 1939, federation was the most important context for political academic discussion pretty much everywhere in South Asia. It was everywhere on university reading lists and exam papers. It was the main topic that kind of India's new Political Science Association discussed and so forth. And the only group really who objected to this federal emphasis until the late 1930s was the Hindu Mahasabha. These Hindu nationalists, now the kind of, ancestors, intellectual ancestors of the BJP, denied the emphasis which Lala Lajpat Rai and many others laid on India's diversity, suggesting instead that South Asia was populated by a single people governed by a homogeneous Hindu culture. But in the 1920s and 1930s, that was a minority view, seen by most political leaders as radically out of touch with the plural realities of social and political life. So World War II was fought between empires on both sides, not nation states. The Allies justified the conflict in the name of the principles of democracy and self-determination. At the end of the war, global conversation was about ways to create larger political entities, so peace would be secured through the connection of self-governing societies into massive federations, not immediately nation states. Some talked about Britain and the United States merging to become a single federal society, for example. The British Foreign Secretary, never anything other than a very practical-minded person, Ernest Bevin, thought that imperial states would give up their armed forces to a single global peacekeeping force, and he saw the United Nations a Freudian slip of written the United States, but I meant to be said the United Nations, saw the United Nations, as Bevin put it, as a world sovereign. In this new climate, the formal avowal of empire was impossible, so Europe's empires were either dismantled, as in India, or reconstituted as federations of quasi-independent polities, as the French or Dutch Empire. For many observers in the global south, the apparent federalization of the West, though, brought the frightening prospect of an increased concentration of the exploitation of Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. So rival schemes of connection and federation were contemplated to unite non-European societies. The Asian Relations Conference, which Jawaharlal Nehru hosted in 1947, is usually seen as a slightly quaint effort to kind of encourage cultural exchange. But in fact, by Nehru and others, it was imagined as the first stage in the creation of an Asian confederation, a new Asian superstate, if you like that would spark not merely collaboration between states, but would lay the foundation for a multinational Asian state which would have China and India at its core. The project failed, of course, because India's neighbours feared that the soon-to-be independent state would, had imperial designs of its own in the region, and there's a lot of talk about, India's imperialism in 1947-48. It was those kind of anxieties, I'll argue in a moment, which rang the death knell for post-war federation, as I'll show. So, getting back to some of the things I was talking about a moment ago, back to kind of Pakistan and so forth, this federalist context allows us to reinterpret Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Sharif Tuzi's arguments for Pakistan's separation that they made in 1942. The point is that they took federation for granted as the context in which they needed to pitch their argument. That context was so overwhelming, the only case they thought they could make for Pakistan as a separate state was to argue for the very unique and different situation for India's Muslims. So they don't say Pakistan should be a nation state like the rest of the world. They say Pakistan should be a nation state unlike everywhere else in the world. So when most observers suggested that the diversity of India called for its constitution as a plural federal state, the two Muslim thinkers emphasized the unity needed for federalism to work. Europeans shared a common religion and civilization, they said, whereas Indian peoples did not. The inhabitants of Australia, Canada, and other parts of Britain's Commonwealth had more in common between and within each society, making federalism work there too. The Soviet Union was united by a common ideology. By contrast, they said, the diversity of India's races, religions and cultures has no parallel in any part of the world. But Jinnah and Toosey could only push their argument for it may be the nation state or for separation so far, because arguing for a nation state in 1942 simply was not plausible. Even they didn't argue for the kind of national autonomy which Pakistan actually went on to possess, but they placed limits on it. Conceding, for example, the argument that Pakistan would have weak borders and be unable to survive on its own militarily, they assumed the British Commonwealth would remain a strong defensive alliance that would protect South Asia from Russian or Chinese threats. In addition, writing as Allied leaders were beginning to discuss the character of post-war political organisation, they assumed that Pakistan's existence would be supported by what Toosey called a new world order, in which, quote, all nations, whether big or small, will work in cooperation. So responding to Congress' fears that a sovereign Pakistan would lead to war in the subcontinent, they assumed that international institutions would emerge which would, quote, establish relations between nation and nation on the basis of equality, protect smaller nations, and prevent war. So for Jinnah and Toosey, who are the closest you get to arguing for Pakistan as a nation state in 1942, Pakistan's existence relied not just on the politics of the subcontinent, but on being enmeshed within a whole series of international cooperative political structures. So I don't think you can treat therefore Jinnah and Toosey's texts as the foreshadowing of Pakistan as a nation state, because they're not quite going as far as the talking about the kind of autonomy that Pakistan actually has. But the more important point is that though they're arguing at a moment, you're making a kind of an argument that is very much a minority argument, even within the Muslim League, and they're participating within a kind of teeming debate about the kind of political entity that Pakistan was going to be. Pakistan was imagined in many, many different ways between 1942, 1947, and even afterwards. And here I think it's important to recognise that Jinnah managed to cultivate his position as the sole spokesman, to use Ayesha Jalal's phrase, of India's Muslims, by appealing to different groups and allowing multiple conceptions of Pakistan to exist at the same time. So most of those alternative visions drew from the worldwide federal consensus, and they saw Pakistan as a trans-regional, maybe even transnational entity, which brought multiple Muslim peoples in South Asia and perhaps beyond together. Of course, before his death in 1938, the poet-philosopher Muhammad Iqbal famously made a strong case for Muslim autonomy, but in precisely such a transnational federal context. In 1940 alone, the year of the Lahore Resolution, the visions on the table included the merger of northwest India with Afghanistan, the division of India into 2, 3 or 4 constituent parts, a very weak central federation made up of strong self-governing provinces that would cover the whole of the subcontinent, and a new Muslim Indian caliphate. Later, they went so far as to include the journalist Z.A. Soleri's proposal for a worldwide Islamic federation. This is made in, I think, 1946, just when everyone was talking about federation. A partner of other multinational states like the Soviet Union and an Anglo-American Commonwealth, which would be united by a common ideology. In this case, he's arguing Islam as an ideology. These kinds of pan-Islamic arguments were discussed across the kind of Muslim League, across Muslim organisations throughout South Asia, with Soleri's proposal being supported, for example, by the Sindh Provincial Muslim League in September 1946. So, throughout the late 1930s and first half of the 40s, both Congress and the Muslim League were formally committed to an independent federal Indian state or collection of states. Up to 47, federation remained the dominant conception of how a Pakistani state would organise itself. Federation, of course, was the basis of lots of the kind of constitutional schemes kind of devised. I only need to think of the cabinet mission plan, which was a proposal for a federal India, which kind of initially the Muslim League supported until it was killed by Congress, his recalcitrance. There were still many possibilities in play, and lots of you, there's many of you in this audience, I really don't need to emphasise that point too, but up until 1947, with the United Bengal scheme, the idea of creating an independent free state of Bengal, which would have left Bengal unpartitioned as one such possibility. So let me sum up where we've reached so far and connect the account I've offered to the history of East Bengal. As I've said, throughout the early 20th century, political leaders throughout South Asia took part in a global conversation about the replacement of imperial rule with democratic forms of government in which people were able to determine their own affairs. There was no consensus, though, not even in one political organisation, about what that meant in practice. The nation and nationalism, of course, were important, but how nations were defined, what kind of political organisation would let them thrive, remained open, and that was true even for the South Asian Muslims allied to the Muslim League. So with no settled answer to the question of how boundaries were to be drawn and then post-imperial states organised, Muslim, Indian and Bengali identities could coincide and overlap until the moment of partition. The actual creation of the Dominion of Pakistan in August 1947 created a state with boundaries separate from the Dominion of India, but it settled little else. In this respect, the situation in Pakistan reflected the broader global context. And this is a moment, 1945, 1946, 1947, in which what's happening in the Indian subcontinent is not unique, and it's happening in many, many other parts of the world. The empires are collapsing, there's a quick, chaotic process of new state formation, but many of the kind of states, mooted states that are created, actually kind of don't survive or transform very, very quickly in a very short space of time. So, you know, in the last years of the Second World War, the British and Polish and Czech leaders think there's going to be, want to create a Polish and Czechoslovak federation, for example. All sorts of different arguments about how the British mandate is going to end in Palestine with, the United Nations plan. People talk about it as a partition, but actually it was creating a federation which would have had the Palestinian nation and the Israeli nation within a single kind of fairly loose federation that would coordinate, that would have a customs union and coordinate economic activity. There are arguments about, what's going to happen in the Dutch East Indies, for example, where the Dutch kind of trying to sort of reinvent empire by creating a new federation in Southeast Asia. So the kind of this moment of flux and the creation of a state with new borders and also with the movement of populations, is not in any way unique. This global. The point I want to emphasise is that this is a global moment of uncertainty. That people don't know what kind of political form is going to dominate. And so I want to dig down into what's going on in South Asia, Pakistan, and in East Bengal in particular. It's difficult to remember the range of institutions that were undetermined in South Asia in August 1947. First, take the economy. Before partition, it was agreed that India and Pakistan would have separate currencies and separate banks. But there was no consensus about the economic relationship between the two societies beyond that, as I showed with my example of the Muslim cotton merchants. It took 6 months until February 1948 for the India and Pakistan governments to declare each other foreign countries for the purposes of customs and excise duties. Jute moved freely from East Bengal to Calcutta until the end of 1948. Even then, leaders on both sides talked optimistically about the prospect of a customs union. And I was reading actually this morning files in the archives where there are kind of people in the beginning of 1948 talking about well of course Calcutta is going to be to remain the market for jute from East Bengal, right? That's an assumption that's being made 6 months after partition. There's that sort of, we see partition as this moment of kind of severing the kind of East Bengal jute-grown lands from mills, because that implies a kind of a division happening in a way that many people just didn't anticipate was going to occur. So the rules for moving the registration of firms, which the Bay of Bengal jute mill I mentioned proposed eventually fell foul of, were developed after only long bureaucratic back and forth throughout 1948. East Bengal's officials were initially positive about a firm that had such a commitment as that firm to Bengal's Muslims, and was kind of really, thinking hard about how to sort of like employ Muslim labourers. By February 1948, the East Bengal government had come to the conclusion that the Bay of Bengal textiles firm was a foreign company, and that's their word. Meanwhile, India and Pakistan's dispute about how to divide sterling balances in London began to drive the dismemberment of connections between the two economies. So August 1947, there's a sense in which India and Pakistan in this part of the world is still going to be part of a single economic unit, but even 6 months, a year later, that's going away. So, second, as both Joy Chatterjee and Neeraj Jayal have shown, neither India or Pakistan determined the basic question of how to define a person's citizenship in detail before partition. both began, to start with, to use a territorial definition, which assumed that birth within a territory entitled to someone to citizenship, and that minorities in each case would not move. There would be very little migration. Jinnah in particular urged Muslims on the other side of the border within India to stick to their respective homeland. But the violence, migration, and then loss of property which accompanied partition led to the demand from co-religionists in the wrong, inverted commas, territory for support from their state, and in the process ethnicized citizenship. Citizenship was not initially marked by paperwork, but fear of an unmanageable process of movement along borders led to the introduction first of permits for movement between East and West Punjab, and then in 1952 on the need for visas and passports for travel across the border both in East and West. Now we see visas and passports as an essential sign of a nation state, but these things were not anticipated at least in the relationship between India and Pakistan in 1947. In 1951, Pakistan enacted legislation which denied citizenship to anyone who had migrated or been domiciled in India. Strikingly, the hardening of the border between the partition states was felt more keenly and opposed more vehemently in Bengal rather than Punjab, where economic enterprises on each side of the border remained dependent on one another, jute being the obvious example, and where there was more regular social exchange. Third, what it meant for Pakistan to be a state for India's Muslims, that even that basic definition was still open in August 1947. Some, of course, wanted Pakistan to be a theocratic state, but initially the dominant view was what one might call a negative view of Pakistan's purpose, in which the new state was not defined by its a single homogeneous cultural identity, but being a refuge for communities who feared dominance in an India ruled by upper caste Hindus, Muslims, but also others. In Pakistan's first year, a plausible case was made by Dalit leaders such as Jogendranath Mandal and even B.R. Ambedkar for Pakistan as a homeland for non-caste Hindus, with Mandal the first Minister of Labour in the central government cabinet. This potentially cross-communal politics had collapsed within 3 years of partition, as Dalit leaders protested against the treatment of minorities in a Pakistan where identities were becoming much more sharply defined and polarised. In his letter of resignation as Minister for Labour before he moved to India, Mandal appealed to the rapidly receding principle of territorial citizenship, noting that, quote, Hindus will never allow themselves, whatever the threat or temptation, to be treated as jimmies in the land of their birth. And it's interesting he's associating Dalits with the broader Hindu community. By November 1950, Mandal had diagnosed an, quote, anti-Hindu policy pursued by the East Bengal government, especially the police administration and a section of Muslim leaders. So, in his letter of resignation, Mandal blamed the anti-Hindu riots in Dhaka and elsewhere in February 1950 for this shift in approach. One of the causes of those riots, Mandal noted, was Muslim League leaders' fear of a movement for the reunification of East and West Bengal by both Hindu and Muslim leaders. To prevent such a move, Mandal argued, politicians had kind of deviously instigated communal riots to exacerbate tension and prevent union. I don't know anything else about these sort of like plots to reunify East and West Bengal after 1947. Maybe they were there, maybe not, I don't know, and I'm sure there are people who know much more about that than I do here. But whatever the truth of Mandal's claim, his suggestion illustrates the degree of openness which still existed about the place of Bengal in the new state even in 1950. Changing the Radcliffe border seemed an unlikely prospect, but different possibilities were still present, ranging from a federation with significant provincial autonomy to the creation of a single unitary state based on a supposedly common culture, common language, obviously, as we know, spanning both wings of the new state. Of course, it was the latter stage with which the Pakistani elite decided to take, with things like the declaration of Urdu as the state language, and many other things, with disastrous consequences for the aspirations of East Bengal. But certainly in August 1947, perhaps not even in 1945, that course was not predetermined. Indeed, at the moment of partition and in the immediate aftermath, something like Bangladesh seemed possible for many within the state of Pakistan. At that point, the possibility of Pakistan as a federation of multiple peoples with an open relationship to the world outside remained open. What changed, of course, was the post-imperial emergence of Pakistan after August 1947 as a unitary nation state, whose ruling elite tried to enforce an idea of homogenous people supposed to share a national culture and language, as I just said a moment ago. the question we have to ask is, why does that kind of why does this sort of nation state, why does this emphasis on enforcing homogeneity occur? And I don't have long to, I've gone on probably too long, but I don't have long to sort of to discuss that. But I want to consider a few of the kind of stresses and tensions, I argue, led to, if you like, the emergence of Pakistan as a nation state as we would kind of now understand it. First, the military anxieties of the new dominion. This is not in any way a new argument. In a context juxtaposed to a much larger rivalrous neighbour, led it to heighten its boundaries with neighbouring societies. Jinnah's hope for the Commonwealth to be a defensive alliance that would protect Pakistan evaporated quickly amidst the collapse of Britain's global power after the end of World War II. Indeed, Pakistan's leaders even struggled to persuade the British officers who commanded its troops to order soldiers into battle against India in the war over Kashmir. Cold War dynamics, of course, here were critical, as Pakistan's concern about India's relationship with the Soviet Union led it to develop a connection with the United States that endured for decades. And, the United States wanted Pakistan to be a strong, centralized state in order to be able to, with powerful leaders, and that's true in other parts of the world, in order to suppress communism. So, secondly, at the very opposite scale, the unexpected scale of migration between India and Pakistan and its accompanying violence narrowed the way in which Pakistani identity was defined, and I've touched on some of these themes. As we've already seen, the idea of Pakistan as a state hospitable to multiple communities was eclipsed here by the notion of the Pakistani state as exclusively Muslim. And I think complex inter-wing dynamics of migration are important here. So West Pakistani Muhajirs created an embattled sense of Pakistan as an exclusively Muslim migrant nation, centred in the heartland of North Indian Mughal culture, or centred in the culture that came from the Mughal heartland of North India. That claim about the basis of Pakistan in a single pan-Indian Muslim culture found little take-up, of course, in precise terms in Bengal. So here the greater freedom and frequent movement possible across the border in the east created a different kind of sensibility, I think. And it's interesting that the regulations are much lighter with about permits and so forth, kind of for migrants in the east than the west until later. So created a different sensibility in the process, also feeding into West Pakistani anxieties about East Bengal as home to a pro-Indian Hindu fifth column. Again, the role of migration in consolidating the emergence of nation states was a global phenomenon. So I'm trying to kind of say that these processes are happening everywhere. Across the world, after the end of World War II, millions were driven to move to a homeland, often which they'd never seen, with new borders after the end of World War II. Poland, Israel, parts of Soviet Union, many places, Algeria, etc. Migration and exchange of population, sometimes voluntary, sometimes driven by fear, sometimes forced, helped consolidate the emergence of many different nation states and develop the sense of themselves as sharing a single unitary national culture. The economy. The collapse of trade with India, which occurred over 2 years, a dispute about sterling balances, and broader difficulties in procuring foodstuffs and other vital commodities drove a turn inwards towards a newly insular definition of Pakistan's national economy. You can trace that, as I did this morning in the archives, by looking at jute and look at kind of attitudes towards jute. And to begin with, Calcutta is going to be where jute is going to be sold. A year after partition, we need to build Chittagong as a port because we can't get jute out through kind of Calcutta and build later build jute mills, etc. And the important thing here is that, as Badruddin Umar noted, East Pakistan was born in a near-famine condition, with the limited options in terms of importing food grain from abroad, currency issues, etc. As Ahmad Kamal notes, the new government sought to intensify its extraction from middling peasants, mobilizing a large proportion of East Bengal's government resources, urging, sometimes coercing, producers to hand over stocks of food. The crisis turned the agrarian economy into a national issue, if you like, nationalising the countryside, the agrarian society. Political leaders paraded the food drive as a massive patriotic effort, and then lamented the lack of national pride when grain wasn't forthcoming. As Ahmad Kamal argues, the state couched the initiative in religious terms or cultural terms, invoking a shared sense of Muslim brotherhood to convince their core supporters of relatively prosperous Jotdars to contribute, while targeting Hindus in particular with coercion. But the effect of trying to nationalise the grain question was, as Ahmad Kamal notes, to create a new cross-communal alliance of small producers offering an alternative definition of a nation, if you like, that helped reshape East Bengal's politics. The failure of the Pakistan government's nationalist grain drive drove the creation of a new party, of course, the Awami Muslim League. So in a range of fields, a complex sort of set of strategies and tendencies worked them out, and anxieties and conflicts worked them out in post-partition Pakistan to turn a loose, ill-defined polity into what looked like a nation-state. That state aspired to enforce a homogeneous national culture, national population, national economy across all parts of the nation's territory. In 1947, that new state offered the possibility of recognising the distinctiveness of the East, perhaps at least. Well, that's what people thought. By 1954, in the Muslim League's crushing defeat of the United Front, that seemed much less likely. There was no straight line even from 1954 to 71. The federal dismantling of the West Pakistani elite's effort to impose a unitary form of nationalism remained a political option. It was, of course, the main point of Awami League politics, and was even mentioned in private as a possibility by Ayub Khan as the only means for Pakistan's long-term survival towards the end of its political period of office. But the emergence of Pakistan as a nation-state eventually created a dynamic of action and response that pushed the state's existence into crisis. National assertion produced regional reaction in Bengal but also elsewhere, which then stoked the anxieties of the national elite, military bureaucratic elite, and led to a further crackdown. And I think we talk about the Pakistani elite as a kind of military bureaucratic elite, but I think what often gets forgotten is the importance of that rhetoric of the nation within their politics. As the bulk of the population of East Pakistan were pulled into that cycle, the possibility and then inevitability of a clash between people and state became more and more likely until it led to the Liberation War. So, a community, and I'm nearing the end, you'll read that. A community defined by shared ways of life and a common relationship to land and geography has existed in eastern Bengal for centuries, albeit with fluid boundaries and overlapping with other forms of identity. You could call that a nation. But this paper, this article, has tried to, whatever I'm doing now, lecture has tried to break the inevitable chain of connection, which assumes the existence of a national community inevitably requires the achievement of self-government in a sovereign, unitary, independent nation-state. There are other ways in which national self-determination, or other forms in which it can occur. Over the last century and a half, fruitful national life has been imagined in South Asia and the rest of the world in multiple forms, within complex multinational polities and regional federations. We've forgotten often about those other possibilities. The nation-state only emerged as the universal generic form of global government in the late 1940s as empires collapsed and other forms of political arrangement didn't weather the turbulent storms of post-war political life. But stitched together in a very short space of time, produced amidst hot local conflicts and the nascent Cold War, the nation-states which emerged kind of in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, marginalised some social groups at the end of others, in many cases containing the seeds of conflict as they did. So they're framed upon the idea of national unity, but they often don't integrate marginal minority or obviously in Bangladesh's case not minority population. Post-war US nationalism, for example, made great efforts to integrate white minorities. Integration is the key word, but they marginalised African Americans, and the civil rights movement is as a consequence. The Indian state subordinated Dalits and backward castes, and by the 1970s there's a really active politics of assertion by those communities. Indonesia failed to integrate citizens with an Islamic vision of the polity's future, and so where marginal communities have inhabit compact territories, arguments for separation have been common. The overlapping of territory, of identity with a separate, a sense of marginalisation with identity with a separate territory in Bangladesh helped the movement for autonomy here create a sovereign nation state. So in achieving that status, the liberation of Bangladesh was two contradictory things at the same time. First, it was a reaction against the injustices contained within the world order of nation states, which, as I said, emerged after 1947 rather than before. But at the same time, the form that anti-national reaction took occurred through the creation, of course, of a new, apparently unitary nation state, the 136th member of the United Nations. So in a complicated and sometimes fraught way, Bangladesh has continued to negotiate its way through those two different roles since liberation in 1971. And let me just conclude by showing that negotiation within the debate within the Constituent Assembly in 1972. Participants within that the discussion reinterpreted the political past of East Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., as a directional flow of events that led to the creation of a nation-state. Defending the constitution against socialists who diagnosed it being overly generic and thought there was foreign influence in it. Khodka Mushtaq Ahmed argued that it, quote, bore the stamp of the characteristic culture and civilization of the nation, this invocation of Bangladeshi national culture and civilization. The deputy leader of the House, Syed Nazrul Islam, traced a long history of Bangladesh since the days of the Mughals and Pathans, but not before, interestingly, to establish the four fundamental principles of the constitution. Others traced events in a shorter time frames, creating national histories of struggle in which the liberation struggle of the people worked its way out over 3 decades. Of course, in this political debate, the creation of this new constitution for this new nation state is the inevitable consequence of these struggles. But this perspective was not, of course, universally shared. At the beginning of November 1972, the two independent members of the Assembly walked out. One of them, the Constitution defined the citizens of Bangladesh as Bengalis, a claim that Manat Bendra Narayan Lama, the Assembly member representing the Chittagong Hill Tracts, fiercely rejected. Chakmas, the dominant community in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, were not Bengalis, Lama said, as I'm sure many of you know. They were citizens of Bangladesh, but their separate cultural and ethnic identity need to be recognised. The response from the other members of the Constituent Assembly was bafflement. Within the debate, Lama's argument was met with bemusement. It reflected, I think, the universalistic aspirations of the new state. Kamal Hussein asserted the state's juridical universalism. All citizens, independent of their regions, were free and had equal rights, as he put it. Others treated Bengali as a fluid, even universal category that was capable of incorporating anyone who happened to live within the territorial bounds of Bangladesh. Disputing the Bengali nationhood of the tribal people was not understandable, as Nazrul Islam put it. The new nation state then cohered around the idea of a unitary Bengali cultural identity. But when challenged in the name of universal rights, that idea morphed or disappeared. We are all equal citizens of Bangladesh, and we are proud of that, as Islam put it.